Defiance Campaign: Petty Apartheid versus Grand Apartheid by Manish Suryapalam, Lily Zimmerman, and Brianna Funk. There were two forms of apartheid in South Africa: petty apartheid and grand apartheid. Petty apartheid is the practice of segregation in the routine of daily life, such as in bathrooms, restaurants, railway cars and buses, and swimming pools. Typically, the divisions were separate but unequal, with non-whites, mostly Africans, receiving inferior utilities and public facilities than whites, which were usually Afrikaners. One example of a petty apartheid law was the Separate Amenities Act of 1953, which segregated public premises, vehicles, and services, with Africans typically receiving inferior treatment. Another example of a petty apartheid law is the Bantu Education Act of 1953, which established a separate education for Africans. This form of segregation would very heavily impact their lives, as African students would suffer from routine neglect through the education system. This law would lead to Africans receiving an inferior education when compared to the education of Afrikaners, which would eventually prevent Africans from being able to earn enough to acquire better living conditions. Meanwhile, grand apartheid is a more extreme form of apartheid. It was a wholly unique system of racially biased laws that limited the personal freedom of all South African blacks and prohibited them from any significant political voice in their own government, a government that controlled nearly every facet of their existence. Some of these restrictions include the removal of Africans from white areas, preventing Africans from having a political voice, preventing the free movement of Africans, and revoking Africans' rights to citizenship. One example of a grand apartheid law was the Natives Land Act of 1913, which created a system of reservations and confined natives to homelands. This is an example of grand apartheid because the government forced Africans out of their lands into separate areas, which limited their personal freedom. Additionally, these homelands were decreed separate nations, which would effectively remove South African citizenship from all Africans. Ultimately, there was an overcrowding and starvation from lack of resources, and anyone who was found outside of the homeland without papers was classified as an illegal immigrant. Another example of a grand apartheid law was the Separate Representation of Voters Act of 1956, which granted only whites political rights. This law was considered grand apartheid because it took away a voting right and a representation right for Africans by preventing black South Africans from participating in their own government and defending their own needs. Ultimately, this law stripped Africans of the ability to resist future discrimination through political ends. The Defiance Campaign took place in 1952 and was the first widespread and multiracial political mobilization against laws concerning apartheid in South Africa. It was led by the African National Congress, Colored People's Congress, and South African Indian Congress. The Defiance Campaign mostly abandoned the non-confrontational nature of previous protests, petitions, and deputations, deciding instead to commit mass rallies and minor offenses in order to attract attention and demonstrate the unfairness of the laws imposed upon Africans in South Africa. The Defiance Campaign opposed 6 unjust laws, which included the Petty Apartheid Law of the Bantu Authorities Act of 1951 and the Grand Apartheid Laws of the Colored Voters Act of 1951 and the Group Areas Act of 1951. The Defiance Campaign was formed in response to the South African government's refusal to repeal the 6 unjust laws by February 19, 1952. While the Defiance Campaign did not achieve its goal of ending the 6 unjust laws, it did succeed in establishing recognition with the United Nations about the horrible conditions of blacks in South Africa under apartheid laws, and rallying many of the African masses and even a few whites in South Africa. These two factors would prove vital in the fight to end apartheid by the end of the 20th century.